What's up, AP guys? We have chapter 38 for you, the stormy 60s, 1960 to 1968. We are quickly getting near the end of the AP curriculum, so let's get going. All right, in 1960, JFK is elected president. His program is known as the New Frontier, and this deals with urban renewal, civil rights, and health care. A couple cabinet members that you need to know. His attorney general was his brother, Bobby Kennedy, who we'll talk about later in this chapter. And the Secretary of Defense was Robert McNamara. He used to be the president of the Ford Motor Company, and he was a numbers wizard. And he brought his mathematical skills to the Defense Department. Kennedy establishes something called the Peace Corps, which is where young Americans would bring American skills to underdeveloped countries. In other words, Americans would travel abroad and essentially do like missionary work in other countries. But it's not for churches or religion, it is for the government or done on behalf of the government. Right, the New Frontier at home. To help stimulate the economy, JFK institutes some tax cuts, and he also spends money on the space program. Billions of dollars are spent to get a man on the moon. He said by the end of the decade, a man will be on the moon, and he was right. In July of 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin land on the moon. In Europe, we have a couple things going on at the time you need to be familiar with. In August of 1961, the Berlin Wall is built, or construction begins. And this is to keep the communists in East Berlin from escaping to West Berlin. In 1962, we have the Trade Expansion Act, which allows the government to cut tariffs to help increase trade with common market countries, or countries that are participating in capitalism. This sounds a whole lot like reciprocal trade agreements from the 1930s with FDR, where the U.S. would decrease tariff rates on another country if they did the same. Okay, we're going to talk about this idea called flexible response. Now, in Laos, which is located next to Vietnam, it's this green country here, and Vietnam is this long, what color is this, pink? I don't even know, it's hard to see. Yes, pink. Here's Laos next to it. There's a civil war in Laos, and there's this fear that there could be communism spreading to Laos. Now, let's go back under Eisenhower. The policy of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was massive retaliation. Now, under Kennedy, his policy is going to be known as flexible response, and this is again instituted by Robert McNamara, and it calls for a variety of options to use in a crisis. And one of these options that could be used is the Green Beret. So think about it this way: if there is a little skirmish, the U.S. will not send in massive planes and this enormous military. Rather, they will send in a small group of people to get rid of that skirmish. Depending on the size of the issue, the U.S. will respond accordingly with different military options. That's flexible response. All right, 1954, we have the fall of Dien Bien Phu, and Dien Bien Phu is located right up here in Vietnam. And France leaves Vietnam. From that moment forward, the U.S. increases its presence in Vietnam. So if you ever see when did the U.S. increase its presence in Vietnam, it all dates back to 1954 with the fall of Dien Bien Phu. The U.S. supports the leader of South Vietnam, his last name is Diem, simply because he is not communist. And in 1961, JFK increases the amount of troops that go to Vietnam, and this will be a theme in the coming years. All right, lots of stuff on this slide. Know everything here. The Alliance for Progress is essentially the Marshall Plan for Latin America. So the U.S. is giving money to countries in Latin America to make sure that they will not become communist. The Bay of Pigs, which is located right down here in Cuba, there's Havana, there's Guantanamo Bay, where the U.S. still has a military base. The Bay of Pigs invasion is an enormously important topic to understand. It is a CIA-backed plan from President Eisenhower's administration. So here's the deal. They wanted Cuban rebels to attempt to overthrow the Cuban government, and this is the Castro government. The U.S. wants the government overthrown because they are communist. The U.S. told these rebels, we will provide aid. At the last minute, they don't do that, so the U.S. does not provide aid. It is a horrible disaster, and Castro and his government is sitting there waiting for these rebels. Now, this leads to a huge amount of distrust against the United States by Cuba, and it's an international disaster. Lots of countries can't believe that the U.S. did this. Shortly after, in October of 1962, a U-2 spy plane, a U.S. U-2 spy plane sees this. What is this? it leads to that was a picture of the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962, the Soviet Union installed a whole bunch of nukes in Cuba, pointed at the United States 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and they could reach many areas of the United States. So JFK instilled a quarantine, or simply had a whole bunch of naval ships surrounding Cuba, not letting anything go in or out. The crisis finally ends 13 days later when the U.S. ends the quarantine and they promise not to invade Cuba. And they also said, we will remove some missiles from Turkey. The U.S. had their own missiles in Turkey. And the Soviet Union withdraws their weapons. What is the impact? This is the closest the two sides ever came to nuclear war. And a hotline is established, or a telephone line, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union so they could work out problems and try to ease tensions. And that is what détente means. And we see the beginning of détente here, easing of tensions between the two superpowers. Civil rights in the 1960s, another important topic that you need to be familiar with. We have sit-ins, Greensboro, North Carolina, where African Americans and white people would sit at an all-white counter and break Jim Crow laws. Freedom rides were bus rides from the north to the south to ensure that segregation was not happening on buses. And you saw this bus here was destroyed. Many people in the South were upset with the Freedom Riders, and they would attack them. They would burn the buses, and it's so bad that the federal government has to provide protection. Also during the 60s, the FBI wiretaps Martin Luther King because there's fear that some of his advisors are communists. We have Ole Miss. This is a college. There is a gentleman by the name of James Meredith. He wants to enroll in Ole Miss. So Kennedy sends 400 troops to help register James Meredith and ensure that he can go to college. This is essentially the same thing as the Little Rock Nine, but on a college level. In Birmingham, Alabama, this is arguably the worst part of the South. And Martin Luther King once said something along the lines of, whatever direction Birmingham goes in, the South will go in as well. Half of the population in Birmingham was black, yet they only made up 15% of the voters. So many African Americans were not registered to vote. We have a March on Washington in which 200,000 African Americans go to Washington. This is where Martin Luther King gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. So lots of civil rights going on in the 1960s. LBJ becomes president when JFK is assassinated in November of 1963. And he is all about civil rights, LBJ. One of the first things that's passed when he's in office is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This bans racial discrimination in private facilities. So hotels, motels, buses, things particularly involved with interstate trade are now illegal if you segregate. It empowered the federal government to end segregation in schools as well. Keep in mind, this is 10 years after Brown versus Board, but segregation is still going on. We also have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the purpose was to eliminate discrimination in hiring. And Johnson also issued a war on poverty to try to help out poor and low-income families, mostly through education. All right, the Great Society, it is essentially the New Deal plus civil rights. So everything that was instituted under FDR in the New Deal, LBJ continued or expanded on, plus added some civil rights. There is a book titled The Other America by Michael Harrington, and this stated that 20% of the U.S. population and 40% of blacks living in the U.S. lived in poverty. So 1 out of 5 total people living in America, and 2 out of 5 African Americans were living in poverty. In 1964, Johnson is running for re-election, and he runs against a Republican named Barry Goldwater. He was a conservative senator from Arizona. Here's Barry Goldwater. His platform was attacking the federal income tax, Social Security, and the TVA. And it is essentially anti-New Deal and anti-Great Society. And his campaigns in the 1964 election, his campaign slogan was, "In your heart, you know he's right." And that's a pun, because right meaning he's correct, and also right meaning right on the political spectrum. Right means conservative. And LBJ responded, his camp responded with, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." All right, big four. There are 4 things you need to know about the Great Society, 4 landmark achievements. 1, aid to education. Billions of dollars are spent on education. Lyndon Johnson used to be a kindergarten or first grade teacher, I believe. He was a teacher, I know that, before becoming president. Medical care for the elderly, that is Medicare. An immigration reform bill we'll talk about, and a new voting rights bill as well as passed. The Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, this eliminates the quotas from the 1920s. So if you think back to the 1920s, 1921 and 1924 were two acts that were passed that limited the amount of immigrants that could come to the U.S. This is overturned in 1965. And the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965 is actually pretty favorable to Latin American countries. It encourages them to immigrate to the United States. One of the most important things post-World War II, and I'd be shocked if this is not on the AP exam, is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Here is Robert McNamara. This is the Gulf of Tonkin, this body of water here. What they allege is that American ships were attacked by the North Vietnamese. It was an unprovoked attack. Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which essentially provides a blank check to Johnson in Vietnam. It allows him to increase the war in Vietnam, it allows him to escalate the war in Vietnam, and it also gives him certain powers that are normally given to Congress. I would encourage you to watch my video, APUSH Review the Vietnam War. There's lots of important stuff in there, and this is definitely covered in there as well. This is an increase in presidential powers during war. Poll taxes and literacy tests, what we learned about during the Reconstruction period in the South, post-Reconstruction as well, they still discourage blacks from voting in the South. So the 24th Amendment to the Constitution is passed, and that eliminates poll taxes. The Freedom Summer is a campaign in which many people, particularly Northern whites, went to help register blacks in the South to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated literacy tests. So the 24th Amendment gets rid of poll taxes. The Voting Rights Act of 65 gets rid of literacy tests. Now, two major problems from the Reconstruction era are now over. And with those will go the grandfather clause. Those are no longer around either. And also, there is use of voter registrars from the Voting Rights Act of 1965, meaning, again, that government officials can go in and register African American voters. All right, Black Power. In 1965, we had the Watts riots as a section of LA, and this changes the black struggle from here forward. The civil rights focus after 1965 is more on separatism, this idea that blacks should embrace their identity and their culture, and it becomes more militant. It's no longer this nonviolent, peaceful message that Martin Luther King was preaching. Malcolm X comes along, very charismatic, very good speaker, and he is a member of the Nation of Islam. So he is a black Muslim. He is assassinated in 1965, and he urged the use of violence when necessary. He wanted immediate rights, and he did not favor Martin Luther King's nonviolent civil disobedience. He encouraged blacks to take things into their own hands if necessary to get what they want, which was certain rights. Stokely Carmichael, he was the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he also goes on to be associated with the Black Panthers. Later on, he promotes Black Power as well, this idea of separatism. And as the 60s went on, there was more of a focus on economic equality for African Americans. All right, we're going to go to Vietnam now, and there are protests on college campuses more and more as the war drags on. And there is a draft, and the draft dragged, as the book says, more and more young men off to the Southeast Asian slaughter pens. So you see lots of Americans are being killed. If you were a dove during the Vietnam War, you were against the war, you would be in favor of peace. If you were a hawk, you would be in support of the war. Don't confuse a hawk from the Vietnam War with a war hawk from the War of 1812. If you see a war hawk, that means the War of 1812, and you should think of people like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. If you see a hawk without the war, then we're talking Vietnam, and it's somebody who supports the war in Vietnam. In 1968, we have the Tet Offensive. The Tet is the Vietnamese New Year and is attacked by the North Vietnamese during the Vietnamese New Year. From this moment forward, U.S. opposition to the war in Vietnam increases drastically. So this is what causes many Americans to start to protest the Vietnam War. In 1968, Johnson says he will not run for re-election, and Bobby Kennedy in the beginning emerges as one of the leading candidates to receive the Democratic nomination. June 5th, 1968, Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, is assassinated by Saran. So the Democrats need to find a new person to nominate. They have a convention in Chicago, and there are riots like crazy in Chicago. People are upset with the Vietnam War. They're upset with Johnson. They are just upset. 1968 was it was called the year of shocks. And the Republicans nominate Richard Nixon and his vice president, Spiro Agnew. And there's a third party, the American Independent Party, and George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, is nominated. He was a segregationist. He favored escalating the Vietnam War. He was quoted as saying something along the lines of he wanted to bomb Vietnam back into the Stone Age. He detested war protests. He thought anybody who would protest the Vietnam War was essentially a traitor. They were horrible. He did not agree with those whatsoever, and he did not agree with the civil rights movement. He appealed to many people in the South, and that's where he will get most of his votes from. So what ultimately leads to the end of Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency? Well, the Vietnam War came at the expense of Great Society programs. Money that was needed for the Great Society was used on the war and vice versa. He could not spend money on both. There's not enough money to go around. A couple years ago, the AP exam had a DBQ on the Vietnam War, and here is one of the documents, a political cartoon. And you notice that the Great Society shirt on the top is worn by President Johnson. And he's being pulled down by another President Johnson wearing a shirt that said foreign policy. So the Vietnam War is taking away money and resources from the Great Society. So ultimately, it did not become as successful as it could have because of the Vietnam War. In the 1960s, we have ton of clash of cultures. This is where the hippies are. They distrust the government. They distrust religion. They distrust superiors. You name it. The theme is distrust, and this is the baby boom generation. At UC Berkeley, we have the free speech movement. They were upset at Berkeley that students were upset at Berkeley that they were not allowed to use school grounds for political debate. Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, this is a group that was very anti-war, and they would use terrorism by the end of the 1960s to get what they want. Very kind of ironic when you think about it. Students for a Democratic Society, they're anti-war, but they're using terrorism to get what they want. All right, that's chapter 38 for you in a nutshell. Please take a moment, subscribe to my channel if you have not already. Take 30 seconds, put this on Twitter, put it on Facebook, send it out to everybody you know. Copy this link into a text message, send it to your classmates, you name it, please. I would appreciate it. If you have questions, comments, any concerns with this video, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I really appreciate you guys watching this. Good luck on your exam. It is coming up soon, and have a good day, guys.